All right, so we're going to begin, right? All right. Hello. Welcome to a late start for our launch event for taking responsibility in the age of AI. Again, I apologize for the screw up that we had the wrong links going. So we're just going to recover and press on from here. Um, um, I'm Mark Jones. I'm an associate professor of practice at ID, and I'll be moderating today's panel. This panel is hosted by the Institute of Design at Illinois Tech, also known as ID. At the Institute of Design, we consider design a powerful tool anyone can use to transform the systems that shape our lives, from cities, education, finance, food, healthcare, technology, all kinds of applications. ID is the only design school completely devoted to graduate students, and we're the first to offer a PhD and recognized as pioneers in human-centered design, systems design, and other methods that apply design to real-world problems. This panel is discussing findings from a recently published report, Taking Responsibility in the Age of AI, which I believe there will be a link to this report placed in the chat so you can get a copy for free for yourself. It draws on research conducted in 2023 by the Institute of Design. We sought to understand the state of design in large, very design mature organizations. As part of that, we interviewed 29 design leaders about the state of design in their organizations and the challenges that designers are best suited to address. And some of the participants came from places like Meta, JP Morgan Chase, Ford, IDEO, and other kinds of places. We found 5 organizational challenges that emerged from our research. And this webinar is going to really just be discussing those 5 challenges. Challenge number 1, organizations need to work at speed to keep up with the accelerating pace of change. 2, organizations need systems thinkers that can address the kinds of complex problems the world is facing today. 3, organizations need facilitators who can bring together increasingly diverse skill sets needed to get new products and services to market. 4, organizations need new metrics that can take into account both human and financial outcomes. And 5, organizations need to demonstrate their values for how they are serving an increasingly diverse population. So our panelists will be discussing these 5 urgent challenges for the next 45 minutes or so. If you have any questions along the way, there is you can place your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll try to incorporate them as we go. Of course, we can't necessarily answer every question, but we'll try to get to the ones we can. So, all right, let's get going. So let's start with some introductions of our panelists. So panelists, please introduce yourself and talk about a challenge that you're facing right now in your design world. So Kevin, would you like to start?
Sure, and hello everyone. I'm Kevin Bethune. I'm coming to you from Redondo Beach, California. I operate and serve as a founder of a design and innovation platform called Dreams Design and Life. We support startups as well as innovation groups and sort of large enterprises. And it's really, we play at the intersection of strategic design and industrial design. I'm also in the throes of writing books for the MIT Press with Reimagining Design that came out in early 2022, and Nonlinear that's set to come out in February of 2025. And the latest conversations I've been a part of is just talking to my peers as it relates to design talent and the challenges that design is facing right now, especially in this period of economic uncertainty and people perhaps questioning the value of design in different circles. So that's spent a lot of my time in those relationships, just helping to offer support in those relationships.
So Katrina, would you like to go?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I'm Katrina Alcorn. I now have the honor of leading the design and digital product practice for North America for Accenture Song, which is the world's largest tech-powered creative group. And just to give you a little sense of my background, so I have been in the tech world in some type of design leadership role for more than 2 decades. I spent the first decade on the agency side, doing, work for hire for clients. And then I went client side. And for the last decade or so, I've been leading larger and larger product design functions in-house. So, hundreds, sometimes thousands of designers, product managers, engineers. And in terms of a challenge, this very much relates to my challenge. I think one of the things I've noticed anecdotally, and there's also research on this, is when design projects fail, it's often because the cross-functional product team is not on the same page. We don't know how to work with each other. We're using different words to describe the same thing and the same words to describe different things. So over the last decade, I've tried all kinds of things to try to crack that challenge. And I think I have some of the answers, but not all the answers. I think I'm passing it to you, Robert.
Great.
Yeah, great. It's so great to be here and to be having the opportunity to engage in dialogue with Katrina and Kevin and Mark. My name is Robert Fabricant. I'm the founder and I lead a small design practice with a global footprint out of Mexico City, New York, Nairobi, Dakar, and Mumbai. We sit inside a firm called Dahlberg, and that means we get to work entirely on kind of public sector and civil society issues. So I come out of corporate design, but today a lot of my collaboration and a lot of the skills we're building are about translating design to policy, to research and social sciences, to public health experts, to governments. And so it's a very different but interesting problem in terms of how you kind of translate and play a similar role to kind of what Katrina described a bit. I'm also an author. I wrote some pieces for Fast Company recently and co-authored a book called User Friendly that tried to kind of set a little bit the background and history for the kind of the rise of human-centered design and user experience and how it's shaping our lives. And an issue that I'm constantly thinking about because all our work is very impact related and focused on systems is how do you find the right and the most compelling and urgent use cases that create enough leverage for systems change. Very often we work on very contextual, urgent questions for people in terms of their health, for example. But in order to address those, there's a whole lot of system actors and a whole lot of bigger scale change that has to happen. And it's very hard to get those in balance. And it's very hard to take the tools of design and figure out, well, how do you kind of find and create that kind of leverage so that you can motivate that kind of scale of systems change?
That's awesome. So I think that this is hinting at some of the themes that we're going to be talking about later, thinking about how do we manage talent, how do teams work together to collaborate, how do we think about the right levers in systems problems. So I think this will be coming up again as we have our conversation. So thank you for those the hints of what's to come. I think we're going to start off with the first challenge, and this is going to be a little bit rambling, so there's no particular order here, but we will start with speed. So how do we sort of reconcile our first challenge, achieve speed, with the much maligned sort of move fast and break things approach? And there's a perception that design slows things down, right? And people talk about things like that. But moving fast is important. But how do we make sure that as we move fast, we don't create unintended consequences? Katrina, would you like to do you have any response to that first prompt?
I do. I love talking about this topic because it is an urban legend, like you said, that design is too slow. And I've heard this from many corners of the executive suite and engineering leaders and others. I think the reason people have that, what I think is mostly a misconception, is because sometimes you have to go slow to go fast. And so, if you have engineers ready to build something and now you need the designers to take some time and figure out what needs to be built, that can feel slow. But what's really slow is when you build something that no one wants. It's also very expensive. So I'm taking inspiration from my friend Peter Merholtz, who had posted something that really got me thinking several months ago. He said, we're obsessed with speed to market, but the problem is what I just said. You rush something to market and it ends up being the wrong thing and no one's happy. So what if we reframe this idea as speed to impact? And I love that because that's what design does so well. we have the mindsets, and we have the methods and the frameworks for pretty quickly understanding what taking human-centered approach to understand what problem are we solving? Are we aiming ourselves at the right problem? And then coming up with hypotheses for how to solve that. And the way we test our hypotheses is usually with a prototype, and I'm probably preaching to the choir around this. But in that process, we can actually move very, very quickly toward the impact that we're trying to drive. And yeah, I would love for more people to understand design makes things go fast. It just makes the right things go fast.
Yeah, that's great. Robert or Kevin, do you want to pipe in and respond to Katrina's thinking about speed to impact?
No, I like the framing, speed to impact. I'm gonna remember that one. Just in my experience with multidisciplinary teams, especially with the complexity of problems that we are facing now and into the future, I just find that sometimes speed can be almost an implied or an invisible authority figure in the room, and to remind the team that, especially when there's concerns, when there's questions, I mean, the desire to go fast is one thing, but don't let it stop you from raising your hand and citing the concern or citing the question, even if it causes the team to pause and think. That's actually a good thing. So I think leadership is demonstrating that it's okay to stop and ask hard questions, especially as we move forward.
Yeah, and maybe building on that, I think sometimes we see speed largely through the lens of product and service, kind of the hamster wheel of launching and building and creating products and services. And there, to me, the critical question isn't speed. I think certain technologies coming out of the environment around Gen AI can speed up certain stages in the process. The question to me is all about skipping. What are you skipping? And can that added speed create space where you can go deep and make sure that you're connecting on some of the implications of the work? And some of that involves making sure you're not skipping the steps in terms of direct user engagement in that process, but not all questions, particularly ones related to what you were raising, Kevin, in terms of the implication and unintended consequences work. Not all of that's going to come out of the user-centered work you do. A lot of that's going to come out of how you engage with other stakeholders, and creating room outside the product and service sort of hamster wheel to have those conversations, build those alliances with people who are collecting different data, who face policy and other risks in the organization. Those conversations can develop relatively slowly and mature and become huge assets for how you kind of manage that product pipeline.
I mean, you're all talking about sort of intentional speed, like that. We don't take it at face value that some things have to go slow and some things faster. And Robert, you just mentioned the idea of AI can speed some things up to leave more room. So for Kevin or Katrina, what do you think that if we had more time, if AI could be a tool to help us essentially create some efficiencies, what do you see as the opportunity to add in things that maybe we're missing?
Yeah. I'll start unless you want to, Kevin. So, I mean, I've seen this in practice, definitely when I was at Autodesk. We were experimenting with early Gen AI tools to where the designer sets parameters versus coming up with a design. And then the system generates lots of different ideas. You could be designing a chair, you could be designing a prosthetic leg. That was one of the interesting case studies. You could be designing a footprint or a floor plan for an office. And then the designer's role is to step in and start to curate those ideas and say which ones have the most power, because designers are the ones with the common sense, not the AI. AI just knows what we teach it. So we've made a big investment at Accenture Song where I work now, and we in Gen AI tools, and we've got our own proprietary tools we've started developing and we're using to help us get to concepts faster. So it's not replacing human creativity. I think, at least I'm not seeing that right now, but it's augmenting it, and it's helping us do more, come up with more ideas, and then we have more time to vet those ideas because we're spinning up so many ideas so quickly.
Yeah. Are other people seeing AI being incorporated in design practice in a meaningful way? Kevin, do you have a thought about that?
I mean, not only in my own practice, but other, peers that I come up against and open conversation about generative AI. I'm a student just like everyone, right? We're all learning and experimenting. There's several opportunities across the creative process to have these tool sets and enablers help. But I'm just particularly conscious of the amount of calories or bandwidth I spend on particular themes of work over the course of a given week, and a lot of time is spent, managing stakeholders and relationships. Another bucket of calories is the actual production work to generate those communication vehicles to collaborate with said stakeholder. And then the third bucket, which is the most precious in my view, getting to Katrina's point, is that creative problem solving itself, the critical thinking. And if AI can help, collapse the first two, categories of time, that's more luxury and more time spent on the most precious critical thinking and creative problem solving. So that's what excites me about the opportunity for generative AI. And I think my peers share that view as well.
Yeah.
Let me give one more example. It's not something I've worked on or my teams did, but it's such a easy example to kind of access. So I spoke at a conference in Macau in December for the Fortune Brainstorm Design Conference, great conference. And one of the speakers was an architect named Keith Griffiths, who works somewhere in the APAC region. And he did a live demo on stage of how he's using AI to supercharge his creative process. So he has a tool, I think it's called XCool, that was developed in his architecture firm. And live on stage, he drew these 30-second concepts of buildings. Now, this is a process that he does with clients. He'll come up with concepts, and then he'll give that concept to his team to try to render it, with enough fidelity that a client could give enough feedback on the concept that, you're setting a direction. So this is in the early stage of design. That process used to take weeks. He showed us on stage. He did, 10 sketches in like a matter of minutes, fed them into a scanner, and his AI powered, magic box spit out these photorealistic renderings while we were all sitting in the audience watching. Now, what that means is, first of all, that it's not like these buildings can immediately be built. So we need to make sure our clients know what they're looking at here. But it's supercharging his creative power. It means he and his team are spending less time trying to develop one or two concepts, and instead they're just going wild, coming up with every crazy idea, so they can just see what sticks, what has the energy, and then they can work on developing that further. So there are plenty of things we all worry about with Gen AI, but I actually take a lot of comfort in this kind of collaboration. I think we could actually become more creative.
Yeah, and I'm hearing a little bit that the potential to create more things faster. But how do you think about back to the original thing about the impact, that we want to have impact, and making sure that the destination that these are questions from the audience, by the way. And how do we what do you do in your practice to ensure that the destination is valuable and valued? And that we have the impact we want when we're using these kinds of tools.
Yeah, so maybe to just jump in, because I kind of teed it up a little bit. What I'm hearing when I talk to people, particularly in larger organizations, is probably to me a little more discomforting, which is that on the one hand, there is a lot of facility emerging at one level, but in the background, there is a continued movement of these tools up the knowledge food chain in organizations. And the things that we're running up against are, in particular, the ways in which the intelligences, the knowledge and data they're tapping are becoming proxies for choices around who matters, what problems matter, what we do and don't know about people. And it's very hard to reinterrogate them. What's missing may be significant, but it takes often a fairly bespoke process to figure out what's missing. And so my concern is that we're having this very delightful experience. I mean, what you described, Katrina, is super delightful. This experience, and it's keeping us very occupied. It's allowing us to feel that we're playing a fairly essential role in helping to drive the train towards products and services. But at the same time, there are very big questions and decisions that we're not necessarily, we haven't yet figured out how to influence. And those decisions to me are central to the question you just asked, which is impact for whom and how and where. And I see this in the work we're doing with large public institutions, whether it's governments or the UN or organizations like that. They're so overwhelmed with problems and issues that they're looking for something to simplify that choice architecture. And it's not that, again, coming back to the pairing of the two, it's not that being able to more quickly make some, get some direction out of these tools isn't helpful to a point. But how do you preserve the space to reinterrogate it? How do you preserve the space to then say what isn't being asked and who isn't being engaged? What could this data be hiding or suppressing? Holding that space as design folks right now, I think, is actually quite hard. And I feel like that's a bit what's at stake, maybe underneath your question.
And maybe just to briefly add, I'm tremendously inspired by thought leaders of the likes of like Monica Belskite or Tim Gabriel, who have been sort of sounding the warning signs, and not playing in the doom and gloom rhetoric, but more like shining a light on some of the dystopian conditions that certain demographics of people are falling under right now. And there's a lot to learn in terms of like the bias that already exists in existing systems and how that could potentially multiply or become exponential with the help of generative AI if we're not careful.
Yeah. Just to sort of extend this a little bit to one of our themes around systems, in the spirit of sort of thinking in systems, a lot of these problems that we're going to be facing in this next period of our lives in the world are going to be quite complex systems kinds of problems. And so how do we achieve a deeper understanding of sort of latent stakeholder needs and the kinds of value that can be delivered through systems and systems thinking to a variety of stakeholders? And I think, Kevin, you were referring to that sometimes we're not connecting with the right stakeholders, or we're leaving people out. So how do we engage the right stakeholders in this business environment to make sure that we get to the right solutions?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think no matter the opportunity that's in front of us, there's usually a plentiful amount of conclusive data. You might call that quants or whatever. Usually that's within our fingertips to grasp. What I find in my practice, what's typically missing across different client partners is just the level of thick data that really taps into attitudes, motivations, unmet aspirations, even human idiosyncrasies, and opening the aperture beyond just the end consumer or end customer in the context of commerce. That we need to like kind of open our aperture, zoom out, and appreciate other actors that are in the ecosystem, inclusive of planet, and that every stakeholder actually has explicit and implicit value criteria that we have the opportunity to satiate. We have the opportunity to meet people where they are across that ecosystem and figure out where is the exchanges of value. And then lastly, under the impingement of different trends and paradigms and wildcards that are affecting the climate right now and into the future, how do we show up when some of those value criteria changes across stakeholders based on those emerging trends and technologies that are sort of in front of us?
Yeah. And just a follow-up on that. So yes, you have all these needs. Various stakeholders all have needs, and if let's say you do a great job and you identify and cover those needs, how do you balance them and negotiate who gets what? And how do you negotiate sort of that solution space in these complex multi-stakeholder environments?
Is that for anyone or?
It's for anyone.
I think my answer to several of these questions is going to sound really old school. I am still a believer in design thinking and the frameworks and the mindsets and the methods that they give cross-functional teams to help us not only collaborate together, but to break down really complicated problems into their different pieces so we can solve for them. So it's not the answer to all things, but I really think that there is so much wisdom in the tool set that designers are trained in, and that we teach the rest of our product teams. And there was, what was the other part of your question? There was something else I was going to say about that. The breaking down, something about breaking down wicked problems.
Well, just we expect that we're going to be faced with these very complex, multi-stakeholder, complex systems problems, and then how do we think about balancing
the other part of that
various
is
needs?
Yeah, I remember what I was going to say. The other part of that magic to me is this focus on prototyping, the focus on testing hypotheses. I have seen people, very, very smart people, get stuck circling a problem for weeks, for months, sometimes years, without actually producing even a pilot solution. One of the things that we can lean on as designers, because that's part of our training, is the prototyping part. It's kind of, it pulls from a scientific method. It's not all science, but this idea that we explore the problem enough to come up with a hypothesis, and then we test the hypothesis by making things. It doesn't, take away the fact that some of the stuff we're working on and our teams are working on are very, very complex. But to try to linearly think your way to an answer without just testing stuff is, I think, impossible. So when you test, at least you get more information, and then you can, augment your hypothesis, your solution, et cetera.
Maybe to jump in here where I think designers struggle, so +1 to a lot of what you said, but where I think they struggle is they come back and they feel they have a result, but the way that result is captured and understood isn't modeled against the way decisions are made in other parts of an institution, organization, government, whomever. Like, what is it about that process you just described that lends some, credibility to continuing to go in a certain direction or question a certain assumption? And so one of the things we try and do up front in a lot of our work is really making sure that we are part of the conversations around the theory of change. Like, what are the fundamental outcomes we're trying to achieve broadly? This is not like a product level problem. This is broadly. When we're launching an initiative, when we're collaborating on a collective effort to drive systems change, and what sort of systems change are we trying to achieve, and who needs to be included in that? So you set a vocabulary. Designers are great systems pattern finders, but they're not always great at structured system thinking, actually. And so the thing that I feel as a leader that I need to do is bring them back to, okay, how do we remap this? And it's going to seem a little reductive at times, and that's the hard part. And at the same time, if we can't pull back out of that thick data, of the deeper learning that we're doing with particularly marginalized groups, or kind of the way of prototyping is informing new opportunities, not just problems. If we can't map it back to that, the way people are viewing and understanding value and impact, then it'll have an immediate positive influence on a collaboration, but it won't sustain itself. So that's a big part for us, and it's not always the funnest part, for sure, for the team. But if we set that up at the beginning, then the other things that we do that are more unique and collaborative and fun and generative, we can map back into that and bring people along. Sorry, it's a long answer.
So how do you, as we think about, there's new tools for, prototyping. We've talked about that with AI and things like that. So how do you represent systems, these complex systems, so they're understandable to all these stakeholders? Is there something, is there progress being made in better communication, better interactions, things like that you see coming that's going to make this go, so we really make sure that we are getting the right feedback, the right solutions, and the right fit? Is there something that's going to be changing using these new tools?
I don't know. For me, it's less about a tool. You could call me old school, but I think when we find ourselves in multidisciplinary settings more and more, there's nothing like getting up, grabbing a dry erase marker and heading over to the whiteboard as the group's in conversation, and a picture speaks 1,000 words, to be able to sort of map the conversation and help people understand visually the exchange of value, how value is migrating, how value is holding steady. And then same for the constituents that we're serving outside of the company walls. Ideally, we're not stopping the conversation and having these transactional handoffs between research and ideation. Like it's never, to Katrina's point, it's never linear. It needs to be like non-linear. To always stay in conversation, to always show prototypes with the folks that we're in co-creating with them to make our answers better over the long run.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I think that it's a great question. And for me, a lot of that potential is around scenario planning and forecasting and futures. And I haven't seen the tool set mature in that area, at least the way we've engaged it. For example, our team has been working in Santiago, Chile with the chief heat officer. And we're playing out systems change, and some of it's very immediate because there are huge pressing immediate needs around air quality, heat alerts, fires, drought that can affect, whether someone can make it to a cooling center or whether a home for the aging can have the backup power it needs to support vulnerable communities through these kind of disruptions. But at the same time, there's very long cycle planning because you're not going to address those without thinking about infrastructure, without thinking about greening, without thinking about many things. And I feel like where we could really see something magical happen, and I know a lot of designers, or at least design leaders, are starting to project and invest more time in thinking about scenario planning and futures. I think that's an area where we can take some of the ways that we've thought in plastic ways about permutations of products and services. How can we think about that in sort of broader future states and model that out in a more collaborative way, but also in a more tangible way using tools that can manifest as opposed to just kind of dialogue some things.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. Is anybody else thinking about tools like scenario planning that being reinvented for? I think you're right. It's like the tools haven't really changed for 20 years, but but have you thought about how they should change or how they might fit in? It makes me sort of think about the we're talking about collaboration. We can get up in front of a whiteboard. We can sort of have all of our stakeholders in the room. We're talking about all these different kinds of people. What does that mean for the field of design? If you think about we used to talk about T-shaped designers, or some people talk about pie-shaped designers, and so how do we think about evolving the kinds of T-shaped or pie-shaped designers for the future to really effectively collaborate? So designers, that's going to change. There's new skills, there's new verticals, there's all kinds of things that are new. How do we really have can design set itself up to be successful with thinking about these T-shaped or pie-shaped designers? Any thoughts on that? Katrina, do you want to maybe start there?
Yeah. I if I were to bring this back to AI for a minute, for the last several years, I've been leading product design functions where we have a lot of people creating new AI-powered products. The work was already complicated. Now it's more complicated because now we've got more stakeholders. We're now trying to figure out how to work with data scientists and all kinds of people, in addition to the engineers and different types of engineers and product managers and others. What I've advised people to do and what I've seen them do really successfully is to lean back on our skills around facilitation, around listening, the unique skills that we teach designers to kind of be the ringleader for these discussions when there is no ringleader. And just give you a quick example. So last year, I had the opportunity to run a workshop with 250 designers in Bangalore. So basically, we were sharing some of the methods that my team had been developing. So these were kind of tried and true design thinking frameworks that we've been using forever, but we've made some changes to them to help drive the kinds of complicated discussions and frankly fraught discussions around data. What data do you have? What data do you need? Do you have the right to use the data? What could go wrong with you when you use the data? And it can get really gnarly really quickly. But I took people through 8 of these methods, and it was a wild success. People could immediately see how they could bring this back to their work and use these methods that were already familiar to them to help drive these discussions. So in terms of, what's changed and what's staying the same. I think ability to facilitate complicated discussions and collaborations with cross-functional teams will become more and more important. I do not see the machines replacing the humans anytime soon when it comes to that kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that, Kevin or Robert?
I tend to look at teaming through the lens of breadth and depth. You know, as Katrina mentioned, this complexity that's now here and moving forward. How well do we each as practitioners and leaders exhibit breadth or demonstrate breadth in terms of being able to bring disparate disciplines together around shared imperatives, future foresight, future scenarios. But then also, I also believe that leadership can come from your depth of expertise as well. So, each of us probably have a couple, areas of deep strength in terms of expertise, a strong pillar where we can actually deliver outputs and outcomes relating to that expertise. And I think those multidisciplinary teams need to trust that we can show how to lead and being able to build, being able to contribute through the creation of prototypes or whatever the expertise sort of warrants. That orchestration is sort of the opportunity, I think, ahead of us in terms of how we team.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I just want to touch on, we're talking about the facilitation of these large complex problems and things like that. And we touched on this earlier about, bias, unintended consequences, things like that are inherently part of these kinds of complex systems as the possibility. So actively, so what can we do about that? How do you think about ensuring that we don't develop solutions that are that maybe have unintended consequences? How can we potentially anticipate those things? How can we make sure we don't build bias into our systems and things like that in our solutions? Is that part of the process? Is it process? Is it, what is it that's gonna help there?
I can offer.
Go ahead, Robert. No, go ahead.
I can offer two things that we're trying to build more as more kind of routine into the way we work. The first is a process thing, and the second actually comes back a little to the team question. So process-wise, we're trying to facilitate right up front a conversation with our client and the other stakeholders about power and who holds it. And really entering the question of systems with a lens on power and where is power held and how is that going to potentially distort both the process and the outcomes. And build in guardrails into the work so that we can catch for that, create an explicit understanding and connection on questions of power. So that's number one. And it's not always the place where designers, I think, feel most comfortable. It doesn't always start feeling like a collaborative conversation when you use the word power. But we all need to get a lot more comfortable with it. So that's the first thing, is where and how is that power showing up? And both coaching ourselves, because we tend to think as designers, we don't hold power, yet we go into conversations with users, with communities, with various stakeholders, and they see us as holding power. And so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is the diversity of the team that we have. No matter how much you build in processes, if you don't have a diverse team, and coming back to T's, I feel like there's a little bit of like behind the idea of a T is a little bit of a conceit of stretching across a lot of stuff, and then depth being subject matter depth. And in our experience, there's just no replacing lived experience depth and range. And what people see and perceive, coming back to power and other issues, how do you create a diverse team that's always going to look at things differently, and then empower their intuition as a critical part of the process? And that, that sounds good on paper. It's not always easy to do. And your clients hold a lot of power. We're, in a client service role, mostly, not always. So I'd say those are two things that we're really trying to institutionalize in our practice, that I feel like can really move the needle. And the right person with the right lived experience can hold tremendous power at the right moment in the process, even if they're not in a senior role.
That's great. And so how do we find those people? How do we get those people? I mean, they're new skill, they're new sort of profiles you're looking at that didn't exist, a few years ago. How do we find them, and how do we make sure that we get the kind of diversity that would be essential, particularly in certain kinds of large-scale problems? Kevin, do you want to maybe think about that?
Yeah, I mean, this topic is definitely very close to my heart. I'm very careful in that, whether it's through my talks that I give or my writings, I only speak from my personal lived experience, and I'm an avid agreement with Robert in terms of that, the power, the depth of lived experience that we each bring to the table. But again, I'm careful to say I can only speak for me. As a Black man who's had a weird multidisciplinary career path across engineering, business, and design, and now working in the space of innovation at the intersections, Black representation in design, for example, is anywhere from 1% to 2%, and it's been sort of shrinking in some cases, depending on specialty. Granted, the demographics that a lot of brands that have in-house teams or work with agencies are serving large swaths of people that might be 13%, and in some metros maybe 50% Black. And I'm speaking in North American context, right? And so you can think about the level of mismatch, the level of cognitive dissonance, bias, potential for harm.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been real case studies right now of where harm is being manifested. I think about that and I say, like, how can we spread our wings, open our aperture to find the best talent that's representative of that diverse tapestry of our society? And I think it takes really leaning into relationships, getting out of your comfort zone to go find those communities where talent exists. I've heard the sentiment, oh, there's no Black talent pipeline in design. And it's like, that's a fallacy, because you have these upsprout communities like Where Are the Black Designers, and the State of Black Design, and other communities that have emerged since the pandemic, where everyone's sort of been on their own island in different lanes. They're finding each other, they're seeing each other, and they're forming new communities around their talent base. So I believe the talent exists. You just have to work hard to earn the right to enter those relationships to attract that talent.
It would be great if we could just magically have this balanced workforce, tomorrow. But in the meantime, how do we make this happen? How do we accelerate this? How do we think about other different pathways for designers to become designers? Can we think about sort of creating the workforce in a different way to make this happen faster? Because we can't go from 2% to 30% overnight with Black representation for design. So what do we do in the meantime?
So I actually, in my last role, I was leading a big design team, and we had a concerted effort to bring in more Black designers specifically, and we did it. And one of the ways we did it, there was a very grassroots effort by, this was a very big design practice. So we had the scale. We had people who actually could volunteer and help with this. But one of the things I love about what our community did, and it was a mixed community, including Black designers, was they used design methods. So they went and interviewed people who'd been recently hired. They talked to HR people. They started to understand what it took to bring people into the company and what was not working. And then out of that research, they came up with some very clear recommendations that was all about making our hiring process more inclusive. So it was everything from who's on the interview panel, how you write the job description. We knew that we needed more Black designers and more Hispanic designers. Also, there's a real social issue where women tend to underestimate their abilities, so they won't even apply for the leadership roles, but men will, even if they have the same capabilities. So they looked at creating a much more inclusive process, and then HR took those recommendations, and I think by the time I left, our Black designer population was around 9%. But the bigger issue is this is good for everyone. It's not just good for Black designers. When you create an environment that makes more room for different types of people, everyone benefits, even people who don't maybe necessarily appear diverse, but there's all kinds of, diversity happens on all kinds of levels. So I don't know, I take a lot of heart in that example. And I think the other thing that I've seen happen in the last couple decades is a lot more of an understanding and focus on the role of psychological safety on a team, because it's not just about hiring people of different backgrounds. It's how do you actually create a space where people can contribute meaningfully. And to do that, people need to feel safe. It doesn't mean you don't hold a high bar and hold people accountable and all those things. It's not just about being nice, but it's really important, the tone that we set as leaders in companies. And so I think there's a lot for people who are leading teams. There's a lot you can do just setting an example in the tone that you set with your team that can make a huge difference for everyone.
Yeah.
One last thing I'll suggest. I really think we need to start looking at other ways to get into the design profession that do not require a college degree. A college degree is simply out of reach for so many people of all backgrounds, but it disproportionately ends up gatekeeping for underrepresented groups. So, and frankly, the best designers I've worked with, it's all about experience and attitude. And if you find a way to put together an amazing portfolio without having the college degree, I think we should value that.
Yeah. So, where have you seen this done really well? I mean, it sounds like this is on all of your minds, that we have to think about the workforce and that maybe think about people and designers in non-traditional ways. Do you have any places that you've seen the world that are doing this really well, that have been trying things? And Katrina, you did share some things that IBM's doing. Are there other examples of things that might inspire us?
I mean, definitely the work the teams did there was really powerful, and it's something that I kind of bring with me into Accenture Song, because I can see, what's possible. So on a different note, I've been inspired by blanking on her last name, Minette, and if someone who knows me, you can put her last name in the chat. I'm just blanking on her last name, but she's written several books about all around psychological safety and vulnerability. And there's something about how she talks about that tone that you set as a leader that I see a lot of workplaces that need it, and I see workplaces that embrace it. I have a completely different environment around innovation. To innovate, you have to be able to take risks. To take risks, you have to feel safe enough to take risks. And so there's something magic around that. Minette Norman, thank you, Shalom. Yes. Shout out to Minette. Go look her up.
It's